Well, for more, let's cross now to Ketevan Gorgestani from our International Affairs Desk. Donald Trump finally meeting with Maria Corina Machado, who, as we saw in that report, a little bit disparaged after the ouster of Nicolas Maduro. He's meeting with her, but he also took on the telephone Maduro's successor, Delcy Rodriguez.
Yes, there was a phone call with Delcy Rodriguez yesterday. It was the first known phone call between the two of them. And after that phone call, Donald Trump took to Truth Social to talk about how great that phone call was. He even separately called Delcy Rodriguez a terrific person. But what's interesting was that he said many topics were discussed, including oil, minerals, trade, and of course, national security. No mention there of any political transition, of any human rights issues. What you're seeing there is the confirmation that Donald Trump and the Trump administration are willing so far to work with everything that is left from the Maduro regime. Nicolas Maduro is gone, but everyone else is there, Delcy Rodriguez and all of the apparatus of the Maduro regime. And that is because the U.S. assessment is that they are best placed to sort of hold on to the stability of Venezuela because they control the armed forces, they control the security apparatus, and that, of course, is necessary if you want to hold on to the oil, to the minerals, to the trade. That is what Donald Trump is focused on right now. This is the context in which Maria Corina Machado is entering the White House in the coming minutes. Donald Trump doesn't seem to have an issue with her, but he did have those harsh words after Nicolas Maduro was taken from his home. He said that she was a nice person, but that she really did not have the support or the respect of the Venezuelan people. So what Machado is going to try to do in the White House is sort of turn the tide on that vision of that Donald Trump has of her, focus on that political transition potentially, and of course the question that everyone will have, and we'll see if this meeting opens up to the press or not. Right now it's closed to the press. Will she give him her Nobel Peace Prize? Because there have been reports that part of the reason he has sort of distanced her was that he was angry at the fact that she didn't immediately hand over that Nobel Peace Prize. She did say that she wanted to share it with him, that she dedicated to him. And of course, the Nobel Committee came into the play saying you can give the prize, but you cannot transfer the winner of the prize, and she will remain the winner of the prize. But we'll see what she does.
Right, and meanwhile, and I'll bring in now our guest on this, Vicente Ulive, Venezuelan writer, author in French of The Fish of Caracas, which delves into the corruption that's been rife for a long time in Venezuela. Thanks for being with us here on France 24.
Thanks for having me.
Just want to get a sense of the mixed messages we're getting. On the one hand, meeting with Maria Corina Machado. On the other hand, speaking on the telephone with Delcy Rodriguez. On the one hand, talking up the opportunities with the regime that's currently there. On the other, the news of this seizure of a sixth shadow tanker in the Caribbean. Which way is the White House going?
Well, it's very telling in Trump's discourse isn't actually what he says, but what he doesn't say. And in the mentions that he's done to the operation, even the day that it happened, he never talked about the Venezuelans. He never talked about the Venezuelan people. He never talked about democracy. These words were not in his discourse, and he focused solely on petrol, which seems to be his only intent. So it's very difficult as a Venezuelan to perceive Donald Trump as a liberator, because he doesn't even seem to be very careful or even care about the state of affairs in his own country. So why would he do that in Venezuela? The situation right now is very complicated because, as was said before, Delcy Rodriguez has to balance this, do this balancing act between placating the base and being able to offer Donald Trump the change that he seems to want. And the question that needs to be seen is the pressure that the United States is exerting on Venezuela right now, with the biggest fleet in the history of the world that is parked in the Caribbean and is intercepting these oil tankers, is that pressure enough to produce a social and a political change in Venezuela. Because historically, we know that what the Chavistas do, like Delcy Rodriguez, they're very good negotiators. We've had negotiations in the past with Zapatero, for example, and they always acquiesce, and they say they're going to do changes, and they have liberated political prisoners in the past, only to put them in jail 2 months later when the pressure goes off. So the question is, how long can the United States keep this pressure up, and is it enough to force a transition with Delcy Rodriguez?
Vicente, let's talk about those political prisoners. Do we know exactly how many have been released? We saw there was one high-profile name, the son of the late singer Q Lazarus, who was freed. But those are U.S. citizens. What about Venezuelans themselves?
Yes, according to the most recent statistics, Foro Penal, which is the most respected NGO, reports 193 prisoners that have been liberated. The government, Delcy Rodriguez, says they have liberated 406. The totality of the prisoners seems to be over 1,000. There seems to be a lot of underreporting, and the problem has been too that many of these prisoners that have been released have been in such a state that they're practically unrecognizable, emaciated, beaten, traumatized. These people are now have suffered a lot. So we're not going to be satisfied until absolutely all the political prisoners are liberated, and until the people that are outside of the country can go to the country without being put in a jail. That's the first demand that we would have.
Vicente, when there was that operation that basically came in and took Nicolas Maduro, kidnapped him, according to some, the reaction of people in Caracas was mostly to keep a low profile. They didn't know what was happening next. Now, 2 weeks later, is there still a wait-and-see mood inside of Venezuela?
Yes, well, Venezuelans know historically that if we celebrate too early, then you wind up in jail. This happened before in the protests in 2014, 2017, and even the most recent protest when people were taking down statues by Hugo Chavez, people manifested this freedom, the want for freedom, and then they wound up in jail. So every Venezuelan knows that removing Nicolas Maduro wasn't enough to bring down the whole regime. So people are very afraid of celebrating and winding up in jail, which has happened and which is happening. And they're actually checking people's WhatsApp and their private phones. They're at checkpoints. And if you exclaim that you don't like Maduro, that you like the United States, you may go to jail. So people in the country are very wary. It is still a police state. People do not want to go out. The civil society has been beaten into submission after being rebuilt by Maria Corina Machado. So people don't know how to organize, and it's very difficult for them to take to the streets right now. That's why you're not seeing that, and you're seeing it especially outside of Venezuela where people are celebrating.
Kedvan Gorjestani, we saw in Cuba tribute paid for the 32 Cubans who were part of the security detail of Maduro killed on January the 3rd. Cuba, which has rejected as political manipulation, the U.S. Sending relief for those who've been hit by Hurricane Melissa. Again, the thought about how the U.S. is sort of looking at Venezuela, looking at Cuba, looking at the broader Caribbean region right now.
Well, look, right after the operation that took out Nicolas Maduro and brought him to the United States, almost immediately after, Donald Trump started threatening the president of Cuba, the leader of the president of Colombia, then the leadership in Cuba, even Mexico. So he immediately started threatening, basically saying, you better play within the interest of the United States if you don't want to end up like Nicolas Maduro. But of course, Cuba is different than Venezuela, is different than Colombia. And over the weekend, Donald Trump really focused again on Cuba. And that, of course, in part is likely because within his administration, his Secretary of State / National Security Advisor is Marco Rubio, who is the son of Cuban immigrants, who is a longtime opponent opponent of the Cuban regime and who would love nothing more than to see the same thing happen in Cuba that happened in Venezuela. That said, so far, these are only threats. Donald Trump said Cuba should strike a deal with the United States, quote, before it is too late. He also said, make a deal or face the consequences. What deal? What consequences? That we don't know. One thing is for certain, and that is more the position of Marco Rubio, and he stated that many, many times, is the hope by some of those hawks that are left within the Republican Party is that there will be a trickle-down effect from what happened in Venezuela, and that will help possibly topple the Cuban regime. Venezuela is the top oil supplier to Cuba. About a third of Cuba's oil needs have been coming from Venezuela. With that breakthrough in Venezuela for the United States and the quarantine, as they call it, of the oil going in and out, Cuba hasn't received any oil shipments since about mid-December from Venezuela. And so the thought is, if there is no oil, then the economy is going to get even worse than it already is. That could lead to protests and possibly the toppling of the regime. That is, of course, a long-term play. But right now, I don't think that the focus is on going after one person in the Cuban regime, but more likely to put increasing pressure on the Cubans, partly through that lockdown of energy.
Vicente Ulive of Ketevan Gorgestani, many thanks for being with us here on France 24. Stay with us. There's much more to come, more news plus the day's business. And we'll be having a look as well at the lineups for the semifinals of the African Nations Cup.